For as simple of an object as they are, dolls occupy a strangely large part of my mind these days. Not as mere objects to play with, mind you, but more so because of their subjectivity and what they symbolize within the realm of fiction. How they can be representative of living, breathing things very much capable of their own thoughts and emotions. And honestly, I don't think I'm the only one who obsesses over them either. Historically speaking, humanity has always been attracted to the idea of the quote-unquote simulacra, something that looks like another, an imitation, a copy, a substitute never quite good enough to truly fool someone. Whether it's ancient tales of creatures taking human shape to deceive mortals, anthropomorphized animals in online communities, the kigurumi-wielding otakus who shed their human skin in favor of their favorite doll-faced anime girl, or even the early 2000s trend of moe blob designs attempting to humanize operating systems and game consoles, there's this weird intrinsic desire in ourselves to seek the humanity within what we perceive as decidedly inhuman, or taking it one step further, trying to find the humanity within the inanimate. Oftentimes those attempts result, even if only for a brief moment, to give motion to what typically doesn't move, to grant them the clemency of free will by the vector of our very own. I think that's something you typically associate with children making backstories for their toys or plushies or whatever, but even as an adult, it's an impression that's never really left me, and still kinda haunts the back of my mind. You know, the idea that what you possess, the things that surround you in everyday life, that occupy space within your home are not just physical objects, but rather conceptual ones too. The thought that the inanimate can, whether by force of will or sheer strength alone, randomly come to life, come to possess life itself, is something you often see in fiction. I mean, so many historical stories use that very same notion. Legends of Pygmalion's ivory statue waking up to reciprocate his one-sided love, German Expressionism's take on the myth of the golem, or even Frankenstein's monster in its electric birth. It's all stuff you've seen at least once before. The consideration that something not living may have a life of its own, the wonder if the things around you hear or feel or think the way you might yourself, may seem a little naive for some, but it's also a deeply human feeling to have. If the doll, quiet as she is, rightfully sits atop a shelf waiting for its owner to come back, if she shares not only her home, but her appearance with something quintessentially human, is it not normal to wonder what she does when you're away? What constitutes her hopes, her dreams, her fears and worries? What does a doll even dream of? While some may discard these musings as they grow older and rid themselves of their toys, I feel like the older I get myself, the closer I come to an understanding as to why, out of all things out there, I find a lot more relatable in a puppet, a doll, or a mannequin than I do in real human beings. Dolls, just like this video, tell a tale of artificial love, or to be exact, of the love of and for the artificial. And what's more fitting of this theme than 2001's true underground masterpiece, a doll whose cold joints and limbs beg to be held, to feel the warmth of another. Malice Doll's play takes place on an already vacated stage. The world has been destroyed and continues to slowly decay as it becomes more and more an empty shell of its former self. Where once resided chaotic noises of busy streets, now rests this awkward silence, a desert of solitude stuck in perpetual standstill. Humans have completely vanished, but in their absence, the presence of life itself has yet to be exterminated. In their wake, they left demiurgic impressions, automatons made in their image, machines expertly crafted of synthetic materials and metallic husks to continue what they personally couldn't oversee, a true mimicry of what once was. Maintenance workers, security robots, and administrators endlessly continuing their roles as they were once instructed, quite literally built solely for those purposes. While these machines inherently carry very traditional human roles, literally jobs to perform, it would be the other citizens of that broken world that would carry on with them the most base human instincts. Android women, built to serve and cater to any fetish or fantasy. These gynoids are a visible contrast from the other machines. They have skin, limbs, lips, and eyes to get lost into. They wear the tattered remains of beautiful costumes, dresses, kimonos, while the others carry on with them a more synthetic feel. Still human by virtue of action, but evidently more machine-like. The dolls, meanwhile, are purposely designed to be a lot more reminiscent of their collective ancestors and creators in their physical appearances despite the still present artificiality their personhood presents. Sex workers by trade, they live together in a rundown brothel where they too once attended to their loyal duties. forever performing for one's eyes. But now, since no humans are left to partake in the carnal pleasures of flesh, the only thing these dolls are left with is plenty of time and silence. Filling that in, they spend most of their days either chatting or trying to sleep, hoping to be granted the reprieve of imagination, of dreams. Each of them endlessly failing at capturing even a simple glimpse of what their human counterparts could freely do. All except one. Malice, our protagonist, is pretty much the sum totality of a modern-day Pinocchio, a girl who endlessly dreams of what could or should be in a world hell-bent on clashing with her idealistic whimsy. Her story is one of personhood, of identity and perception, of what it means to be. Despite the initial presumption that she's still an android, she's certainly a deeply human character. She spends her time with the other dolls, of whom she considers friends even. She talks of the past, reminiscing on good memories, of the future and its uncertainty, constantly inquiring of her friends' well-being. But as all dolls are, she's still tangibly a material object. Over time, her parts become loose, her joints start breaking down, and she finds herself wishing for a world where this eventuality simply didn't exist, where this looming threat didn't put into question the sanctity of her and her loved one's livelihood, a world where she could escape her decaying body. Through this quest of healing, she finds herself guided by a strange ghostly figure in order to meet the fabled repairer, a machine capable of helping her. But what she ends up finding there would be the gear that turns her entire world upside down, a giant egg hiding some kind of creature, an organ unlike anything else out there that takes her and forcefully implants its seed of humanity within her, infecting her with its living limitations of time, of physicality itself, creating a new split Malice, one seemingly human who kinda embodies the Cartesian mind-body dualism, but by way of post-cyberspace fantasies. This is where the story truly begins. Obviously, there's a lot of information and nuance I left out since this happens pretty much exclusively in the first 30 minutes of 3 episodes. That's all stuff I'll get back to and elaborate on throughout the rest of this video's runtime. Malice Doll, as in the OVA, is one of those stories that's just so deeply important to me on so many different levels, to the point where even just the prospect of talking about it in this format feels in and of itself like this giant insurmountable task. Very similarly to my latest video on Shoujo Tsubaki, there's always been a lot of buzz surrounding what it chooses to portray in its dark story of biomechanical complexities. Its profoundly drenched psychosexual anxieties always quietly at the forefront of my mind, making it a really resonant piece of art, especially nowadays in an age where topics like these are a lot harder to discuss earnestly online. Like many of my favorite things, it's an OVA that's been slowly buried by the sands of time until the last few years, where it saw a massive resurgence online, clawing its way back amongst niche circles and enthusiasts alike, which funnily enough kinda mirrors the circumstances surrounding its original release. Produced in 2001 by Studio Gaga Communications and Soei Shinsha, Malice Doll was released exclusively in Japan and suffered the unfortunate fate of being chucked straight to video, with the only few people who caught it being the exact brand of weirdos who'd spread its word online and speak about it in hushed tones, which, let's be real, is the exact type of shit I love to hear. This entire situation really infused a certain air of mystery to the whole thing, mystery and intrigue of which would be even further accelerated by the fact that it's written by none other than the extremely notable, and even more extremely eccentric, Chiaki J. Konaka of Serial Experiments Lain fame. Completely unsurprisingly, this information was like a dart thrown at fucking Mach speed directly aimed at the softest spot of my brain tissue. Malice Doll felt tailor-made to my sensibilities, inside and outside. It captivated me, it haunted me, an at the time impressionable teenager with unrestricted access to the internet. Just like Lane, I barely understood half of it on a first watch, but what I knew was way more important. It made me feel something, made me feel weird inside, made me question what it could all possibly mean. Even with its short length, what it manages to do and speak of in only 3 episodes felt like the loudest reverberation in my soul, permanently altering how I think and speak of art in the years to come. Konaka felt like the perfect choice of writer for a project like this, a man who not only made dolls of his own, but too shares that fixation with both the idea of the simulacra, of doppelgangers and dolls not only as sentient creatures, but ones acting of their own volition. Something illustrated throughout pretty much his entire body of work, from early J-dramas like Alice 6 that aired exclusively at night in select prefectures only, to his more popular works like Lane and Digimon Tamers, to even tokusatsu shows like Ultra Q Dark Fantasy. Its 24th episode titled Hitogata, roughly translating to human shape, is one of the best examples here. Inspired by Edogawa Rampo's story, The Inhuman Love, the episode features a doll whose obsessive powers allows her to absorb human thoughts to use as energy, constantly infecting the people around her and creating this really ominous vibe in a show already filled with super ominous setups. A lot of people whose hands graced Malice's creation were folks Konaka had already worked with in prior productions too, like director Ketaro Motonaga and character designer Shinobu Nishioka, both working alongside him on the anime adaptation of Go Nagai's least progressive and equally most progressive manga of all time, Devil Lady, or Devilman Lady depending on where you come from. Both the manga and anime are genuinely bizarre world counterparts to each other, in a way I really fuck with, but that's defo for another time. When asked about the process behind writing the script, and if the story was treated as either an anime, live-action production, or even a 3D gig, Konaka describes working on Malice Doll as something closer to a grand guignol, a piece of theater, calling back to its puppeteering inspirations of days past. A puppet on a stage, animated by shadowy forces and prancing around on invisible strings through nauseatingly pristine CGI. In the same interview, he's asked about what the connection is between the production and the actual dolls he's made prior, to which he replies, "Making actual dolls is a completely different matter from writing, but this film was an interesting experience which led me to think about what a doll actually is. Something not entirely surprising considering the fact that this whole thing was written at the same time as the second season of The Big O, a mecha anime that also happens to use doll theming throughout it, specifically thinking back on episode 15 with Dorothy, on top of having a big part of its plot influenced by the idea that the world our characters inhabit is just a twisted specter of a real reality outside of their perception. Figures and dolls kept animated solely by the will of an outside force enacting them into play. This weird stilted quality of characters being basically just sock puppets controlled by something or someone else is a recurrent theme in most of Konaka's work, but is especially present in Malice Doll, not just thematically speaking, but especially visually. You know, for as long as I can remember, I've always had this strange love and adoration for anything that used the kind of 3D graphics Malice proudly sports. I think a big part of that has to do with the fact that I was born smack dab in the middle of the 1990s, a time where those practices were no longer exactly in their infancy, but rather slowly crossing over into the realm of rapid consumer commodification. 3D was suddenly way more present in mainstream media, from video games to cartoons to even live-action integrations. The idea that suddenly, animation had a whole new dimension to play with and explore, and what that notion entailed for the state of art in its many respective mediums felt incredibly exciting. It's kind of a given these days with giant blockbusters and 100 gigabytes 4K textures AAA games releasing every couple of months by massive corpos left and right, but there was a time back in the day where that sort of jump in technology really did feel alien to me, like a whole new world suddenly opened up. There was a certain mystique to it, a certain charm. I think nowadays that feeling's a lot harder to capture or even convey to an audience because we've gotten to the point where 3D animation, as in largely in video games, is trending towards the hyper-photorealistic. There's still a lot of really cool stylish productions to this day, especially in modern animation, but when most people think graphical improvement, they default to thinking about how many pores or follicles they can see on the whitest dudes on this side of the world. There's legit people selling games like GTA 6 solely on the basis that you'll be able to see individual fingerprints on stripper poles. Insane shit. Seeing years of rampant commodification of 3D through others' artistic proclivities, sensibilities, and to a certain degree its more refined, or rather polished usage within mainstream properties feels incredibly antithetical to my own vision of the medium. Fancy way of saying, I've always felt that in the transition to a more marketable landscape, we've also happened to lose something very important to its core, something tangibly human to 3D art. Quite literally the rough edges being smoothed out, paved over, each model taking more and more definition over time to the point where now it feels almost overly polished, which in my opinion doesn't make it lesser per se, but defo less interesting to me. My favorite usages of CGI have always landed squarely within outsider art, left field media, and deep heart-to-hearts. The type of stuff made by folks just tinkering with shit until something cool happens. I think most people, as in modern mainstream audiences, would typically consider Malice Doll's 3D computer animated imagery to be odd-looking, weirdly uncanny, or even ugly to some degree. And honestly, I can kinda see why. It's extremely rare to see something that hits those exact same notes, something that looks even remotely like that. But personally, it's that entire aspect as a whole that attracts me the most to it. Its visual uniqueness and flair feels like a genuine gravitational pull to my sense of style. It's kinda wild. The way it looks, the way it feels, the way every character is animated with these incredibly stilted motions. Small yet imprecise movements perfectly fitted for a world filled with androids and dolls alike, mimicking humans, but never convincingly enough. It's basically early 2000s Kamishibai paper theater by way of eccentrically eerie CG. It's a product of its time for sure, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be seen as a bad thing. Malice's entire world hinges on that kind of artificiality, a desolate world full of plastic toys given life, rendered moving by arcane forces straight out of our wildest dreams. So to hear that Malice has quote-unquote bad graphics feels almost silly of a remark. It feels like a lack of understanding that his entire vibe was a clear aesthetic choice by the artist who painstakingly crafted that world. Each and every 3D model in there is built solely with the limitations of the era in mind. When talking about visuals like that, or even just when folks talk about early CGI in general, there's a big emphasis on its limitations technologically speaking. I've never really understood that line of criticism, of calling stuff like this dated for looking like something that came out when it did come out, because inherently it's stuff the artists and modelers had to take into consideration. I find the tendency of anachronistic retrospective backwards comparisons to different eras to be a little reductive in the end. Like, of course, the project that was made in the early 2000s doesn't have the same poly count as the current day mega blockbusters. That shit had to render on many IBMs through many sleepless nights. Plus, I don't think criteria like that should even really matter all that much. The discussion surrounding if Malice Doll has bad CGI or not is an outright denial of the artistry behind it, the reason why it's like that in the first place. The technological limitations were always a factor at play, and most certainly is in anything coming out pretty much any time, even today. In my mind, that aspect reaffirms the OVA's place as something truly special that could only happen exactly then. To go and illustrate the beauty to be found behind artificiality is to slowly come to terms with the idea that humans as a species has kind of a demiurgic complex. In religious texts, the demiurge is described as this invisible creator of all shapes and forms. Benevolent were they in offering us matter that is both infinite and inexhaustible, and with those, a profound attraction for creativity. In giving humans the ability to create in many ways, it has also infected us from the very first minute with that insatiable desire, that pull towards artistry, towards demiurgy itself. We wish to create something like ourselves, in the shape of a puppet, of a doll. To distinguish ourselves, we give matter of any kind the love it deserves. We're entranced by the idea of creating itself, so much so that it transcends all barriers. I've rambled about this a lot already, but I'm truly obsessed with the sensation of something as nebulous as cheapness itself. Even stuff like the inferiority of material ends up mattering a lot, in ways I think not a lot of people consider on the daily. It's not something I expect everyone to get right away, but it's a feeling you've most likely felt before. When watching a movie or playing a game, to stop and realize that the many hands of its respective creators were responsible for what you're seeing in the first place. To peer behind that artificiality and directly into its soul, so to speak. We're not just entertained by those insights, but we're truly in love with it. In a way, this is why I feel like early 2000s 3D CG is kind of the only way to really get that sort of doll-like aesthetic across. It was the perfect moment in time where technology and fidelity weren't yet synonyms with each other. Just take, for example, small details like how Malice's skin texture changes drastically between her doll and human forms. The former has a gaunt face of molded plastic, a pastier complexion with this almost Bunraku puppet-esque quality to it. Clear white skin, dead eyes, and stiff movements trudging her along slowly, while the latter feels a lot more full, visceral in a way that only flesh can really be, her movements feel a lot more natural, more fluid as opposed to everyone else around her. Each doll, complete with their eternally pristine-looking faces, remind me a lot of the mangaka Seno Knife and her artworks. The way their hair rests on their heads has that same sort of feel, of a strange kind of ghastly intangibility. And the way their eyelashes counter their eyes so gracefully, it fucking owns. Like stated earlier, the OVA's cast of character and their designs oscillate drastically and clash between each other. On one hand, you've got the anthropomorphic dolls such as Heather, Doris, or Elsa, feminine in both their appearances and names, who constantly sport an air of stoic elegance, clad in these gorgeous outfits, while on the other you've got the machines and workers who tend to err more on the side of mechanical homunculi. almost boyish in natures with names like Freddy, Joe, or Todd. They sport tattered cloaks, pipes, and metallic shells in hopes of covering their perceived unnatural deformities. Something very fitting, as they were mostly designed by Yasuhiro Moriki, who you might recognize from works like Gundam Alpha-Wave's Key Gundam, the mechs from Martian successor Nadeshiko, and even the Hades Project Zero Reimer OVA. Though, despite having two sets of visibly different characters embodying different design ideologies, everyone shares that same feeling of looking like dejected toys of days past, both inside and outside. They move strangely, almost unaware that they're unfettered by the bounds of a puppeteer, yet still entirely constrained by the limits of their own artificial bodies. With their plastic sheen and emotionally barren faces, all they can do is continue on their everlasting set of tasks. The Bunraku and toy comparisons don't stop here either, as Chiaki J. Konaka himself cited multiple times his inspirations, ranging from the European stop-motion of Jiri Turnka and Jan Svankmajer, all the way to the traditional arts of Japanese puppetry. Promotional material for Malice Doll even went to the length of calling it less so an anime production, but more so an animated play. I don't think it'd be controversial to say that, for a long time, Western critics approached Japanese animation with a lot of baggage and preconceived notions when it comes to its sense of aesthetics. Even with fairly normal designs, mind you, I spent my life sitting there and biting the inside of my cheek every time I'd have to hear some random middle-aged dude talking about just how weird anime girls like Sailor Moon look, with their big hair, giant glass eyes, or exaggerated proportions, always missing the point that purposeful stylization is the basis of nearly any and all art. And while I think that sort of commentary is slightly shallow or even reductive, I also can't help but agree that this sort of bag of homogenized qualities is something still present to this day, and defo calls back to man's obsession with the inanimate. Though I think Japan's artistic spheres and their appreciation of the human inhuman runs much deeper. Anime, or even Japanese art as a whole, seems to also share that fascination with the simulacra. The doll not simply as a toy, but as a person of its own, capable of enacting actions by itself. Rosen Maiden, Koset no Shozo, even shows like Chobits use doll-like motif, some even applying those same ideas but to robot girls instead, almost an analog of itself, a mechanical evolution of that specific motif. That presence has to be partly attributed to doll artists like Mari Shimizu, who I spoke about in the Weird Art video, or even Simon Yotsuya, whose works continue to influence still to this day. Even more mechanically oriented works like Mamoru Oshii's Ghost in the Shell 2 Innocence can't help itself but to tie dolls to the concept of subjectivity itself, of humanity's consciousness. The Major's appearance traded wholesale, from its fully formed cybernetic coat all the way to something much smaller, taking it up a notch with a very fetishy look to its gynoid heroine. Kamuro hairstyle and red juban, an outfit very unfit for its presentation as a stoic little thing. It feels like a purposeful callback to Yoshida Ryo's 1986 piece Suguri, a very similar doll in its choice of contrasting garments, with its gray face empty of emotion. The movie even goes out of its way to feature the works of one certain Anspell Mare, whose influence can be felt throughout pretty much everything I named so far. All of these comparisons feeding even more into Malice Doll's cultural heritage of worshipping the inanimate turned sentient. Going back to the basics of the OVA's visuals, it's kinda wild how much consideration for vibes was put into the setting itself. The backgrounds especially bring in a really potent vibe. The town and its empty stands and gloomy dilapidated theaters. Old ukiyo-e-style art seen peeking here and there, a reminder of what was lost over time. The grimy remnants of a world with only shadows inhabiting it. The empty museum halls of skeletal curiosities. A room a doll like Malice couldn't realistically understand. After all, creatures like these have long since to exist. It creates this really tense atmosphere from the get-go. Same for the room where the repairer lives, with its checkered patterns and cryptic instruments just looming in the distance. The way the characters inhabit those backgrounds and move across them too adds so much to the ambiance. I've spoken about it before, but in a way, it reminds me a lot of Mari Shimizu's dolls in Alice in Dreamland. The way they move has that same visually distinct texture. Empty halls, pristine dolls, and puppets just dragging themselves across increasingly esoteric locales, though this time around with a healthy mix of darkness added to it. At times, Malice Doll legit feels like scenes taken out of Baroque on the Sega Saturn, with its digitized puppet enemies and grungy atmosphere. Funnily enough, Eisaku Kito's work on the game would also include a ton of physical dolls, and he'd even go and make one of the Major from Ghost in the Shell 2. Looks fantastic, by the way. There's this passage in Bruno Schultz from Taylor's Dummies where he describes spaces losing their lives, so to speak, by being forgotten or not being visited often. Rooms being overgrown with the surrounding bricks meant to protect them, physically closing in on themselves. I think really that's what Malice's setting evokes to me in my mind. A world truly left to abandon, just like the dolls and machines that have been carelessly thrown away, now forced to live in a space that keeps getting smaller day after day, until it starts to feel suffocating for anyone that's unfortunate enough to be left behind, to be forever stuck in that dark misery until everything breaks down over time and ceases to move. The world's sterility, even further shown by how each character's name is ordered all neatly in full forms like titles: Malice Doll, Heather Doll, Joe Administrator, Devil Leukocyte. When meeting Joe for the first time, Malice recites his full name almost like the process of signing into a website, their names quintessentially being reduced to post-humanity email addresses. It underlines the fact that this world that our characters inhabit is one where function, less so than relations, determine your identity. It's tragic, really. Hello, hi, real fast before the video continues. My latest video on Shoujo Tsubaki got turbo demonetized the moment it gained traction, which means I gotta plug my Patreon once more. I know, I'm not crazy about doing this so often, but I do like paying rent and my bills, so, you know. It's nothing fancy, but it does give you access to my Discord server, and since people have been asking more and more about that lately, I figure it's good information to drop here. It's been there for years. This segment's really just an excuse to thank everyone who's been generous enough to, 1, keep me afloat in these hard times, but also the people who support my work in general, even when I take nearly a year to pump out each video. That shit means the world to me. Anyway, back to Malice Doll. Between all the stuff I've watched, played, or read about over the years, there's a disparate amount of them whose tangible sense of aesthetic is tied, almost entirely melded with artificiality as a core concept. But with that sense of brimming enthusiasm comes an even more present force at play, the feeling of uncanniness. Unsurprisingly whatsoever, a big part of my enjoyment of Malice Doll, or really anything related to the doll or doll-like, comes from that exact feeling, of seeing something that could pass as relatively lifelike, but still not being there yet, clearly missing something to fully make our brains recognize it as distinctly human. To me, there's a weird sort of beauty to that, like a feeling of perceived imperfection, completely devoid of perceptible flaws in its static stoicism, yet still giving you the sensation that something's not quite right here. While I do take issue with some parts of the analysis, part 1 of Sigmund Freud's essay on the uncanny traces back the origin of the word to the German Heimlich, as in the homelike, or the familiar, but also draws direct references to its other meanings, such as concealed or hidden. This comes closely to coincide with German unheimlich, the strange, foreign, or more importantly to this video, the uncanny. This comparison suggesting that the uncanny, quite literally translating to the unhomely, is intimately tied to the familiar, the homely. Hence the fear of the uncanny's logical conclusion being to draw from the familiar, the things you know, or rather, the things your brain recognizes. Instinctively, it's pretty much hardwired into giving you that sort of reaction when it comes to simulacrum. Dolls, puppets, mannequins, statues even, they all carry with them a certain vibe, right? Maybe not entirely horrific by themselves, but unnerving enough to make you second guess at times. I think that's something that comes up often when talking about dolls in general. It might sound a little silly to drop this premise like 20 minutes into this video, but turns out people find the inanimate creepy. That's kind of been the basis of it all since the dawn of time. People fear what they don't understand, and something that looks like you, that feels like you, yet doesn't move an inch or even breathe creates that sort of disconnect in your mind. Many movies have come and gone before to illustrate that sentiment, from the most arcane to the most mainstream. Yet despite the tons of variety within adaptation, one thing remains for sure, that uncanny feeling deep in your chest. Far beyond the realm of physicality itself, when thinking back on Malice Doll and how it perpetuates that sensation, I think back on Franz Kafka. In The Cares of a Family Man, he describes the puppet like Odradek, a living creature made of wood, as having the kind of laughter that has no lungs behind it, sounding more like the rustling of fallen leaves than a human's voice. It's something present throughout the entire OVA's duration. Characters are more often than not delivering lines that carry that purposeful sense of dejection, of stillness. A human performer pretending to be the voice box nestled in a doll's chest, or maybe the doll taking an uneven life of its own.
こんにちは。 上アドミ。
おかしなところから冷却液が漏れている。
私、壊れているの？
壊れていない機械者はこの世界にはいない。皆そうなのだ。永遠を生きるにはどこかを直してゆくものだ。
The horror in that case partially stems from dolls being so intimately tied to a reflection of humanity's own capabilities. It's an idea that's been eternally passed around, uncanniness stemming from the inanimate being given motion, or as to whether or not it bears an excessive likeness to the living. Both blessed and cursed by having been given the shape and looks of things we often choose to not look at, it creates an ambiance tied to concepts of childhood while still feeling extremely distant from it. Thomas Aquinas singled out animation as the definitive factor behind the quality of the human soul, calling it the starting point of all motion in things which live. But when it comes to something that doesn't move, that shouldn't move, the simple prospect of seeing it brought to life, to be given a soul of its own, brings its creepiness to attention. The doll shaped to look like an infant, or the faceless mannequin resembling a woman's contour, is only really one step away from what our brains would easily classify as something unliving, as something dead. Human in its appearance, but completely motionless. Waxworks may look alive on the surface, but their lack of inertia sets off a key flag in our minds that it's missing the last ingredient to the mix: consciousness. Doubt as to whether an apparently animate object really is alive, or on the flip side whether a lifeless object might secretly be animate, is the basis of both my fear and obsession respectively. Dolls invoke that primordial anxiety of the double, the doppelganger, as in someone whose appearance causes an almost psychic shift to the narrative, an overbearing likeness like no other to the point where one might identify more with the facsimile than the true self, or become so unsure of the true self that they might substitute the other self for their own. It's a topic that's really well loved by Chiaki J. Konaka, as it appears in pretty much all of his works. Just as an example, Serial Experiments Lane uses R.D. Laing's theories on mental illness to quite literally fracture our protagonist into 3 separate entities with separate personalities, while Alice 6 would mix a handful of idols and force them to question what it means to be in the eye of the spotlight. Truth is, Konaka just can't help himself but sprinkle his own ideas with a helping of his copious inspirations, and honestly, I'm all for it. Like, even though it's never really explained why Malice sees apparitions of a small girl, anyone who's even remotely familiar with his body of work can immediately clock the Alice in Wonderland influence well worn on his sleeve. The ghastly doll representing a sort of play on the role of the White Rabbit, or even Lewis Carroll's original Alice, now fallen down the rabbit hole and trying to tempt her namesake into joining her through the looking glass. Malice, in turn, a real not-so-real girl delving into a world of seemingly unreal reality. Malice doll's take on the doppelganger is a pretty apparent one to me, with our protagonist quite literally having been upended, replaced wholesale by its own simulacrum, a body double of new quality which upsets the balance of the world. Malice seeing her own reflection within that wish-granting moon brings many questions to us, the viewer. What or who is the true self? How do you know you're the real you? Who's the dream and who's the dreamer? After all, if a doll isn't capable of dreaming, the very act of conscious thought isn't something granted to a body that's aching from its lack of oil. And finally, who knows what's real? Who's to decide? On the surface, Rabbids is deceptively simple. The camera is primarily in one spot, facing a living room where 3 human-bodied bunnies inhabit the stage. 3 characters, sometimes 2, perpetually stuck in a dollhouse of intense tension, trying their best to live through the haze of an unwilling performance. Nothing much happens, nothing seems to happen, and yet you're watching them, and in turn they're aware that they're being watched. While maybe not exactly dolls themselves, the main cast embodies the same energy as that sort of youthful look one has towards a toy. A child puppeteering around 3 dolls, or perhaps even simply peering through the cage of an animal before plucking it from its home. The play home, quite literally, with victims of ever-loving make-believes, constantly put on display for our eyes, their eyes to see. Would you believe me if I said this was one of my comfort movies? I remember stumbling upon Rabbids in all of its obtuse obscurity as a small child under some pretty bizarre circumstances. My first watch of each episode was through an entirely contextless, nameless 240p re-upload on YouTube from a channel filled with other contextless and nameless re-uploads. Somehow, for some reason, I just happened to land on this one out of so many others. That moment, so pivotal as it is in retrospect, didn't feel any different than playing Russian roulette on YTMND or 4chan. though now recontextualized with years of experience behind me, felt like the metaphorical opening of a gate to an entirely different universe, one that could never be closed again. For more than 40 minutes straight, I sat at my shitty computer desk in the dark, completely motionless, glued to my screen for the entirety of its runtime, never once feeling the need to question myself as to whether any of this would even make sense or not. When I first watched Inland Empire years down the line, that feeling would once again perk its head up with a visual reminder of a few bunnies in costumes being held hostage. That extravagant taste for mystery was infectious. The prevalent malaise that came over me back then only grew and festered in the recesses of my stomach, rotting eternally as I, myself, body and mind, rot in the uncertainty of what it is I'd even witnessed in the first place. People often ask what's wrong with me. I think to truly understand that, you need to be willing to shed your human skin for a bit and bare your teeth at the shadows. The low-frequency, rhythmically electrical hum of static beckons me to a door. I slowly turn its doorknob and enter the room. I'm met with the roaring applause of a pre-recorded audience. Something's wrong. My life is whatever the other person in the room wants it to be. Therefore, when I'm alone, my life is nothing. It's pretty obvious in its thematic presentation that Malice Doll's story is one heavily concerned with concepts such as humanity, or especially femininity. On the rewatch, I couldn't help but think back on Osamu Dazai's Joseto, a book which also did get a weird early 2000s CGI Kamishibai adaptation. Long shots of static pictures without movement, just leaving you to take in the words of a lonely schoolgirl who's hurting too much on the inside. It's a common thread through pretty much every story regarding dolls. The angle of a girl's perspective, one who wants to feel the agency of being a woman, yet doesn't have the knowledge of what that entails exactly. Just that fervent desire pushed by the passage of time, of seeing others be what she deems herself unable to be. There's a lot of extremely poignant visuals regarding that, specifically in the first episode. Malice's bedroom and its decor reflects well her character's identity crisis. Mirrors lined up on each walls, reflecting back to her the anxiety of being, of wondering, who am I? What do I want? In a world built on the opposition of those values. When Malice chooses to follow the ghostly girl towards the repairer, there's a moment where she's stopped by her leg giving out. When she looks down to see what the problem is, she's greeted with the sight of oil dripping down from her thighs, wondering what that is. It's really hard not to immediately associate that situation's visuals with that of a young girl horrified at the thought of her first menstruation hitting harder than anyone could have prepared her for. There's this incredibly hard-hitting scene just a bit after when she meets the repairer. Malice talks pretty openly about feeling like there's something wrong with her, that not just the leaking coolant, but also the dreams she's subjected to indicate in some way that she's fundamentally broken beyond repair, that the abnormality terrorizes her even if she can't put it in words properly. To me, that's something horrifyingly relatable. There's a heavy focus early on in the OVA on the idea of staying true to the status quo, performing your task as demanded no matter the cost. The entire moment that tears apart that sort of established monotony is a deformation, a literal breaking of Malice's body manifesting in tears, coolant leaking from one of her eyes, a symbolic gesture that sets everything into motion. When Malice starts experiencing those anomalies and takes it upon herself to go visit the repairer, she finds herself the prey of this weird shambling creature that lost its mind over the years of passive inactivity. Leukocyte's relentless attacks against Malice ends up tying well into its namesake, leukocyte being taken from the white blood cells that attack foreign bodies, almost suggesting something in regard to Malice's own condition in the plot, that those anomalies she displays have now branded her permanently as a foreign organism within the world she inhabits, something not meant to be there. That point becomes even more critical to the OVA's emotional core when Malice undergoes that initial transformation. She wakes up from what seems like too long of a bad dream. Yesterday's fears of aching no longer present in her soul. Her voice has changed. Her body has changed. But the world still rejects her. The now flesh-like Malice is filled with all these new feelings she thought herself unworthy of. But in that chaotic mix is only one dream: to share her gift with others, to make them understand and feel what she feels. After meeting back with Joe and the other workers, who at this point no longer even recognize her, she gets attacked once more by Leukocyte in the tunnels, the climax of the first episode mirroring its start with another appearance of Melissa Piper, the robot who initially saved Malice during her first encounter with the monster by dragging her into a hollowed-out recess of a construction pipe. An action that was rewarded by a simple kiss, the little bit of levity, of comfort that Malice could afford a dear friend, something she describes gently as, "the only thing I can do." It's sweet, It's entirely devoid of the raw animalistic passion one would ascribe to her line of work. In a way, it's a deeply innocent gesture. She doesn't know any other way to engage with the people around her, to show them that she cares other than that simple act. It's all she can think of offering, and that alone means 1,000 times more than it looks. When Leukocyte defeats Maliza Piper, Malice can only find it in herself to kiss her dear friend once more, who in turn accepts it willingly just like before. Yet in that kindness lies misguided ideals. Now that she's human, Malice's kiss, once a symbolic gesture of kindness, of love, takes on a far more nefarious aspect. Her only gift to the world being turned into this venomous weapon able to breathe life into the inanimate. It is horrendous. It is excruciating. It deforms without prejudice those mechanical bodies that were deemed quote-unquote obsolete. So when she tries to spread that gift to her friends, she finds herself thoroughly rejected. The other dolls immediately exhibit caution around her, someone who they deemed now different from them. After all, how can a doll now turned human be given responsibility over changing the lives of other dolls if those experiences of life themselves are something she doesn't understand fundamentally? High in emotion but lacking the foresight, to me, Malice is life itself, reaching beyond questions of organic or inorganic, and reveling in all of its twisted peculiarities. Yet despite her name, Malice isn't doing this for bad reasons, far from it. She wants her friends to feel like her, to be like her, to reject that life of stagnation, those broken and hurting bodies, and instead become what she considers herself to be, as in real. Is it wrong to chase agency, to want to be better? I mean, the world around them is slowly dying off. The parts necessary for the uptake of their bodies are disappearing one after the other, and soon no one will be there to help them. Not everyone can turn a blind eye to that fact and continue to maintain their duties. But the thing is, despite being inorganic, inanimate, those people, they still had lives, meager as they were in the continuation of their daily tasks. Real or not, it doesn't really matter in the end. They still had humanity. Malice never once stopped to consider what that meant. That to be changed, first you need to dream, to wish, and finally, to want to be changed. There's a certain The Thing-esque quality to the OVA, especially with how every doll gets singled out throughout the second episode's runtime. Malice always managing to force them to her side. It's really sad. You can see each of them struggling to come to terms with their own bodies, their crumbling sense of agency. The only one putting up a meaningful fight is Doris, who tries her best to cling on to her individuality until the very last moments. She finds herself unable to walk, her body completely giving up on her, and that's when she turns to begging Malice to save her. In the end, the gift deemed to be a life-saving kindness is just a stimulation, forcing people against their will into a life that's seemingly better. But the reality is asking you, is it better to rid them of their perceived flaws if it leaves them as deformed shells of their former selves, writhing in blissful agony? The dolls' bodies are changed one after the other unwillingly. Some default back to their hedonistic passions while others crumble under the realization of what happened. Meanwhile, the more masculine robots are all turned into violent amalgam of flesh, pulsing tendrils and gnashing teeth of raw animality. In a way, it feels as if Malice convinced herself that the feelings she personally experienced were universal, that every one of her friends wished for a new body, and therefore came to the conclusion that they all felt nothing towards her plight. I think everyone might have experienced something like that. You feel lonely, broken, and your friends don't notice, so you immediately default to thinking that they hate you and don't care about what you're going through. The only one who seemed to care at all being Heather, a doll who, from the very get-go, even prior to her transformation, always had the dream of being just like her big sister Malice. Completely unaware as to what that transformation entails, she accepts it wholeheartedly, because in the end, that's just one more step towards her idealistic goal. But unfortunately, all good things have an end. When Joe Admin fights back against Heather, who now transformed wants to turn him into flesh, she finds herself unable to cope with the reality that humanity comes with the possibility of feeling pain. Similarly to Amanda, who turns another machine to flesh but receives an equally grisly reminder of its cost. The line, "I think we should be able to change how we see fit," comes up during the scene where both Heather and Malice confront Doris. And to me, that's reflecting that need for agency towards their own bodies, towards their own lives. A reaffirmation that even a doll, something deemed lesser, has its own right to live. Elsa, who was once broken as a doll, now gets a second lease at life, but under that new grotesque form, which forces us to consider if it's even worth it. I think really you could look at the aftermath of any of the other characters and feel that same sort of confused feeling through and through. An ethos of melancholy, of shame, of regret, of reckless abandon. Some giving in to their newly found impulses, other quietly thanking malice for their new forms, while some would rather spend their last days contemplating the idea that perhaps those changes aren't what they truly wanted deep inside. Inevitably, it's a gesture of profound love that breaks Malice's relationship apart with Heather, or even with everyone she's deemed uncaring. A kiss that deforms their body, a symbolic act that ends up being their undoing, the capacitor for their transformation into something not quite doll, not quite human. The way I see it, Heather's desire for change wasn't stemming from an inward want, but rather an outwards one. The need to be just like Malice, to be next to her, to hear her calming voice every day, to live with her. It's heartbreaking to see Heather, now half monster, half doll, bleeding out on the floor, dejected and lamenting her body's change, something she wanted but didn't understand all at once. It's only really after her death that Malice starts seeing the truth for what it is. Her kiss changes the world, yes, but it poisons it, and the people she once held dear suffer because of her. No matter what amount of bargaining, of stating that this isn't what she wanted can bring things back to what they were, the damage is already done. By that point, Joe Admin admonishes her desire for change. I mean, after all, this is something she explicitly wished for. She thought all dolls and machines share the same wish as her, to not stay the same, to transcend their bodies of which were forced to perform task after task, again and again, repeating the same functions every day in a seemingly never-ending loop of mundane days. In this way, Joe kinda embodies the looming presence of the demiurge, the original creator modeling the world as if clay. He even mentions that a world no longer eternal is one he no longer finds himself able to control, implying that the life Malice has created is no longer of his domain. Yet he still finds it in himself to help Malice despite her seeming transgressions against his world. That is because a machine does not feel pain, nor remorse, nor anger. Joe Admin simply is. The way my voice goes from data on a solid-state drive all the way to your speakers then into your ears. An idea, a concept. Joe ends up being the greatest ally Malice could have because he does not see the wrongs she's perpetrated as such. Despite not recognizing her as a doll at the start, he learns to accept her as she is. Human or doll, it doesn't really matter to him. She's nonetheless a creature worthy of care, a person worthy of care, to the point of even willingly subjecting himself to a kiss, permanently altering his shape, giving him now a finite amount of time on Earth, also he could, and I quote, see what she sees, to put himself in her shoes and help her no matter what, to be able to look at her and say in earnest, I may not understand your pain, but I will always love you nonetheless. Marie Poupée, directly translated from French as Marie the Doll, is a 1976 film by Joël Seria, and in my mind one that feels intimately tied to projects like Malice Doll. While never directly cited as an inspiration, after watching it, I can't help but think about its place in relation to works surrounding the doll or doll-like. In a way, it goes even beyond the realm of mere inspiration, where most works tend to blend to one another, themes overlapping across pieces that seem completely unrelated, but still share with them that one singular art for the inanimate, the same feelings regarding it. It's really special. In all of its violent pastel color schemes and psychosexual subversiveness, it chooses to focus exclusively on the idea of womanhood seen through the lens of male-oriented fetishistic tendencies. Our protagonist, Marie, is an emotionally stunted girl, traumatized from a prior incident and rendered nearly infantile in her behavior, something that attracts men like Claude. Claude happens to be a strange man too, nearly infantile in his enthusiasm and extreme care for the inanimate dolls he prizes in his shop. It's love at first sight, though where those childlike hopes of a forever love and happily ever after start to wane is where the real story can finally take form. Claude isn't interested in his new wife for the noblest of goals. In fact, he seeks to own her as an object rather than to cherish her as a person. The candy-coated interiors of their shared home only ever masking his true intentions. Marie is surrounded by endless beauty, pristine house of dollhouse decor. She is never wanting because she's given what she wants, and typically what she wants is nothing more than the attention she craves from the one she loves. She's completely oblivious to Claude's paraphilic desires because his kindness is a front for something she doesn't have the ability to put in words yet. He makes her pretend to be a doll during extensive roleplay sessions where she's expected to be completely unmoving. Always gentle in his motion, he lifts her, bathes her, but completely denies her an important part of the human experience: sexuality. All goes well, until suddenly, it doesn't. Marie, the virginal ingénue, is then forced to grasp at the idea that his one-sided desires start to clash with hers. By the time the movie wraps up, all we can really do is ideate on a couple of ideas it tried to convey. It's an uncomfortable watch through and through, and it never shies away from letting you stew in those exact feelings of awkwardness. It's slimy, it's dirty, and yet it rarely ever looks the part, more concerned with regal elegance than raw animosity. The stiltedness that comes from its sort of performance play, of pretending to be this cutesy fairy tale story of a girl happily marrying the ideal man, is the perfect pretense for that real insidious shit. The entire time you're watching, you're practically made complicit as a viewer, forced to witness all of this going on without any recourse or time to take a breath. I love it. The film forces you to confront those ideas and implications head on, to evaluate what they mean not just for Marie in the context of the movie, but rather what it means for every woman, animate or not. So much attention is put onto topics like Marie's lack of agency, something reinforced by every member of the surrounding cast. No one ever talks to her the way they talk to each other, because they deem her lesser in some way. Marie is not quite little girl, not quite doll, so every conversation she's involved in takes a more distant approach. Men carefully handling a porcelain poupée, beautifully smiling but ever so empty on the inside. Similarly, the movie puts a lot of emphasis on the uncomfortable idea that some men value concepts like virginity, the appeal of a woman being quote-unquote pure for them. Childish behavior is made to be a performance for shadowy audiences of fetishistic ingrates. Marie doesn't willingly choose to partake in that scenario, for her emotional impairment comes at the cost of very real trauma she was made to endure, so it feels doubly awful to watch her being slowly compressed into nothing more than a role to submissively play, to forego one's identity, one's humanity, to fully submit yourself to a one-dimensional persona. Male sexual repression is always at the forefront in Marie Poupée, Claude's relationship with women being a lot closer to the Madonna whore complex rather than simple admiration. He's a lot more attracted to the objectification and fetishization of the female form, rather than gripping with what said form entails with all of its flesh and emotions. Another character later on in the story would even further add to that aspect of sheer dehumanization. This time a lot more sexual in nature, a man who sees Marie's kindness only as a way to eventually abuse her. For as much attention the male aspects of sexuality get throughout this, it's inherently the female sexual awakening that sets everything in motion. Marie discovering that despite being forced to live the life of a doll, docile and quiet, she too, like anyone else, has wants and needs, and that those facets of lives are important to explore openly and freely at the risk of finding yourself in this precarious hostage situation to your own desires. Marie Poupée is very reserved in showing those feelings, the end quite literally stating simply and very openly, she died from being a doll. It's cut and dry, but in a way that feels like the only way to approach something like this. While sexuality itself is key to the story, the awakening to those emotions are never presented in a bombastic way. While other films would have you believe that puberty or sexuality is a transcendental moment that quite literally unshackles your soul from its gravitational anchor, this, on the other hand, chooses to go with a lot more of a naturalistic approach. One day, it just clicks. You wake up and feel like something changed. You can't really put it in words. It's not something you've ever felt before, but you know deep down that from now on, you're never going to be the same. The idea of having agency over our own bodies comes hand in hand with topics of femininity, and of course sexuality. If it wasn't obvious from what I've already spoken about throughout the course of this video, Malice Doll is an OVA legit drenched in eroticism. I mean, just look at every episode's titles: Hard Flesh, Oral Infection, and Perverted Organism. Not only does each of them go hard as fuck, but they also strive to create a certain picture in the mind of their audiences, one of extreme and virulent virality. Sex and sexuality are more than just subtext as the story progresses further and further. It's not only integral to the events Malice and our cast go through, but also creates a sense of pathos that operates on a nigh impossibly human level. It's a feeling that appeals to me on such an intense degree. The notion that the characters you see struggling through topics all too familiar are ones that come with the human experience as a whole. Sexuality is core to Malice's personhood, from actions to reactions, from past to present to future. It's something the work breathes in and lets you think about throughout every scene. A lot of energy is put towards musings about identity, of what it means to be or to change, what it means to belong and spend your time alternating between the anxieties of looking too inwards or forever outwards. Those aspects reflect heavily on pretty much every facet of the series. You see, just recently, Malice Doll came under fire online for, and I quote, looking like porn, which honestly, I kinda find silly of a prospect. Like from the get-go, yeah, it's straight up an 18+ anti-OVA, so you kinda get what you expect, but also, something so psychosexual in nature of course has to feel this way. So to levy it as criticism against its integrity feels a little odd to me. Maybe if you're someone real cool who spends your day cranking your shit silly style, you might associate Malice Doll's exact brand of CGI models with those of, say, Umemaro, or even erogays like those of Forrester. Crazy output that studio had, by the way. Not only did they make the extremely niche but incredibly lovable PC-98 game Kuro no Ken, but also they would go on to make a ton of really cool and inventive erogays down the line. From the school life in Gakuenzi Into Ona Kyoshi no Inbo, with its occultic rituals and evil summonings, to the Alien and the Thing-inspired parody of Space Journeys Gone Wrong, all the way to the extremely pristine and almost Castlevania-like doll, with its fitting title and super stylish characters that would fit in pretty much any RPG of the era. I know it's kind of a silly comparison to make by virtue of erogays literally being video games, but each character really does have that video gamey look to them, if you get what I mean. Check out the art book if you have the chance, the whole thing fucking owns. It's all stuff that kinda has that same sort of aesthetic trademark, something that goes beyond just similar era or visuals. The way each model still has that uncanny, unsteady look to it, with modelers constantly trying their best to apply the anime girl principles to the medium of 3D. That's something you can spot really well in pretty much any early otaku figures or garage kits, with years of artisans trying to translate the proportions of their favorite 2D characters to be not just accurate, but also good to look at from any angle in 3 dimension. It's surprisingly a really precarious balance. The visuals really do have that sort of obby-esque quality to them in their prototypicality, with a scope that's kinda limited by necessity, but still manages to convey the rawest of emotions. Each model is made with the most passionate of ambitions and dexterous of hands. But yeah, all in all, I don't think there's anything wrong with using sexuality, or even just the idea of being horny as a motivator for fiction. A lubricative narrative device, if you will. I don't like these different pieces of media in spite of their inherent horniness. I just like them for what they are. And that's the same for anything I enjoy, really. Because to me, the idea that Malice Doll might be seen as lesser because of its exploration of sexuality feels really detrimental to the state of artistic discussions. I've spoken about this specifically in the context of Shoujo Tsubaki and its years of genuinely extremely painful online discourse, but the idea that anyone from actual children to man-children online will default immediately to calling this stuff, no matter how tame or emotionally resonant, porn-brained or gooner-coded, is just incredibly demoralizing as someone who genuinely loves that kind of art. It's legit infantilizing in the sense where I don't think it should be taboo to want to convey emotions through anything from kinky designs to hardcore sex scenes, no matter how objectionable those are deemed to be. Cause really, sexuality is too often denoted to be a lesser emotion by folks, and I find that to be really fucked up. Porn or hentai or whatever you want to call it is something that will always exist, regardless of legal status or ways to access it. But to openly dismiss something like Malice Doll, or to outright want it suppressed because of its exploration of said taboos, feels insanely ridiculous. It's so important, especially now more than ever, to allow for discussions like these, to allow these depictions in art. While some folks might find that, yeah, sexual assault is gross and fucked up, it's also an integral part of allowing folks to articulate sexuality in ways most mainstream sexual content is typically uninterested in. I feel like trying to define what kind of horny is good and what kind is bad is pretty fucking lame anyway, so miss me with that shit. It's also unnecessary when it all turns out to be basically internet cop behavior from more and more generations of reactionaries falling for the same old reductive views on art. Plus, it's not like Malice is outright hardcore every second in its depiction either. It's all fairly tastefully done, despite the very blatant plot worming its way into holes and orifices. The presence and presentation of these core aspects in Malice Doll don't feel nearly as graphic or extreme to warrant that kind of reaction. At least, that's the way I see it. It asks its viewer to feel sympathy for the victim a lot more than to admire the work of the perpetrator, if you get what I mean. Eroticism, or eros, no matter what form it takes, no matter how questionable, is something so deeply tied to the doll's experience as it's presented both in fiction and in reality. From its very inception in our lives, humans have been fascinated, obsessed even, with the concept of the doll coming to life. To hold the promise of intimacy, we're entranced by the idea to an unremarkable level, to the point where it's practically hard-coded into modes of thoughts. But why do we, time and time again, choose to suspend our disbelief in hopes of seeing the faintest traces of movement? Why is men fixated on the inanimate? Why do we dream of those things coming to life, or even themselves possess the desire to breathe in life? Where are those fantasies coming from, and how are they finding themselves linked to the question of love and perversity, of carnal or textual lust? The topic is hella dense, but nonetheless something that perseveres through every doll's incarnation, whether that be the man-made idol of adoration, or the craven lust-conveying image of 1,000 hands past. The answer is never really clear, but I think the closest I can think of would be that the doll is a multifaceted fetish in its most rudimentary form. Whether the word remains tied to its ancient definition, the religious fetish, its more modern one, the commodity fetish, or even the purely sexual form, the paraphilic fetish, that's a whole other question for you to explore, but one that remains at the forefront of anything deemed doll-like. The doll, the mannequin, the statue, or even the puppet is in a unique position as an object that both represents a stand-in for something, for someone else, but also acts as a sort of independent entity on its own as well, one deserving of great consideration. As such, each of them offer much in their ability to tell us about our own fixations regarding the inanimate and our relations with these things. Even without getting weird about it, as if I hadn't been weird this whole video, it's hard to deny that there's something inherently appealing to the man-made shape recreating the so-called ideal. Thinking specifically of cases like that of wax dolls or anatomical recreations of human bodies. The Venerina by Italian sculptor Clemente Susini comes to mind, a wax model of a woman with a 3-month-old fetus in her womb. Her body's adorned with hair and a reserved necklace of pearls covering her neck, laying her head back, her stomach protruding from her rest, beautifully held in place forever. I think there's something to be said about the contrast between male and female medical models and the visual language they choose to use. The bodies of the female models typically feel closer to the language of erotic art, usually laying back in positions that feel a lot less stressed, more natural in their extension of their limbs, typically used to showcase inner organs and body parts, while their male counterparts are held in positions that facilitate showcasing their muscles, something traditionally associated with masculine values. Female models, on the other hand, tend to document inner organs and reproductive systems, something traditionally associated with more feminine values. Similarly, it's impossible for me to dissociate those specific visuals from the feelings experienced when seeing sleeping people, or even taking this to its logical extreme, the bodies of those who have died. Dolls embody that same sort of transitional stage in our perception. They are what defies against those laws of nature, prevail even against concepts like death, going beyond it. They're graced with a forever body, crafted with meticulous attention to detail. Dolls have that certain quality to them, where they slowly oscillate back and forth between life and death metaphorically speaking. When you pick it up, play with it, or even just think about it, it gains a sense of being alive, so to speak, while still being technically an inanimate object, something inert. Dolls are the truest form of anti-memento mori, a reminder that the definition of things like life or death are a lot more nebulous than what they look like on the outside. Even though most dolls, puppets, statues, and automatons can never physically move by themselves, at least without intricate inner mechanisms, they titillate us with thoughts of immortalities as the purest suspension of time. An object, a thing that carries some sense of soul, but can never truly die. The maybe constantly at the back of your mind. Its ambiguity is uncanny for some, but personally I really love it. It's mysterious, it's whimsical, admiration and curiosity constantly vying for attention in the front of my mind. It's that exact feeling that you can find in so many stories about dolls, that strange mix of love and confusion. Pygmalion and his statue, a man who falls so deeply for his own creation that he can't picture himself living in a world where she can't reciprocate his affection, praying, begging every night to Aphrodite to grant him the simple wish of intimacy, so that his love can finally be complete. That obsession for perfection, as well as his love for the inanimate form, and the prospect of that form coming to life, is both endearing and strange at the same time. In a sense, I feel like Malice Doll's world represents a sort of twisted view on that myth, a possible post-Pygmalion-esque society, one where every idol, every statue, every doll have all been awoken, come to life in search of energy, but are now instead forced to confront their creator's most primal urges of carnal desires. A world where the ending of Pygmalion's story is simply repeated ad infinitum, without love nor passion. A psychological return to the mechanical, the forcefully animated inanimate. I think really, a lot of folks are attracted to dolls or even their more mechanical counterparts, robot girls, for that same easily classifiable reason. They provide in both form and function the basic fantasy of the shape of a woman, but without any of the elements that make them truly human. The ability to act for itself, to choose for itself, having a personality, wants, hopes, or dreams. Dolls are the ultimate endpoint of objectification, quite literally. You don't need to build a relationship with someone to gain their trust and develop an appreciation for each other's presence if all actions are done exclusively from one side only. Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke argues that a person who plays with dolls might have a hard time reckoning with its inability to return interaction, with its silence, seeing it as an absence of reply, a love that might feel too one-sided. In his own words, he says, "Who knows whether later in life many a person does not draw from such memories the suspicion that he cannot be loved. So in that case, dolls represent a longing for unconditional love, something that remains unquestioning in its faithfulness and loyalty, only ever having eyes for you and you only." Malice Doll leans heavily on that heartfelt notion, that dolls are basically just objects of twisted sexual worship trapped in entirely unwilling relationships. They're literally material items with the purpose of imitating live woman, simulacrum made from men's eyes. And in that, it asks its viewer to question how the doll itself feels. Now no longer a shell, a proper imitation, but instead given emotions and a voice of its own. How does she come to terms with the reality of her predicament? The scene that leads to Malice gaining her humanity is pretty blatant about how she's feeling regarding all of this, or rather what exactly is happening to her. She's sexually assaulted by what she believes to be the repairer, a figure she thought she could trust and rely on. And despite her previous role as a robot sex worker, with no say in the matter, regardless of circumstance, it's only upon that exact moment that she brings herself to utter words of resistance, stating to stop, that otherwise she will break. It's really traumatic of an experience. It's that same malicious organ which envelops Malice at the end, turning into the White Rabbit before revealing its true identity as something akin to a womb. Its role as the metaphorical guiding to another world, but also quite literally the beginning of one entirely. If Malice is to be human, then she must come from a mother's love, right? But what is that exactly, and what form does it take? Not only are the parallels pretty blatant with her original transformation, but also the equivalent act of the birth of her new self is reflective on the way she was treated in her doll life. In both cases, she finds herself taken advantage of physically by phallic shapes of unknown origin, faceless and desireless love thrusted upon her against her will. There's a scene where Malice sees herself and the other dolls completely inert and only partially built, kinda mirroring the metaphorical birth of her new self. Dolls yet unpainted by a crafter's meticulous hands, drawing much closer to mannequins than actual women. We're never really told as to whether they're being built or being dismantled, quite literally oscillating in the middle between life and death. She looks into her own eyes from the outside and recites her mantra once more, "I am a doll." That scene is really important to me in how it approaches our protagonist's mental state without feeling the need to say anything. That vision, it's a reflection of what she is, what she was, what she hopes to be again, but also something she desperately wanted to run away from. It's really evocative. On top of that, it's immediately followed up by some pretty graphic depictions of what her actual job as a doll entailed. Eyes vacant, she's being taken over and over. New angles, new shots, new poses, all manufactured for the amusement of sadistic patrons. No reactions whatsoever, even when someone cuts her face open with a knife. That new, not quite doll, not quite human, Malice feels rightfully upset when confronted with that reality, constantly stating that she's a doll, forced to understand her place as not a person capable of thought and therefore consent, but rather an object for someone to take willingly and oftentimes by force. Until now, I would pretend to feel pain, but now I can actually feel it. Misty, one of the newly transformed dolls, laments this while sitting atop one of those BDSM horse contraptions. Now truly subjected to all facets of her work and what they inherently imply. No longer a doll used for pleasure, emotionally distant as things happen around her. Now a permanent witness completely aware of what kind of pain intersects with pleasure. Back when Malice was still fully synthetic, she couldn't understand what consent meant. She wasn't allowed it. Abuse was something she was expected to face day in, day out. This wasn't something to question. It was her sole purpose in life, quite literally programmed into her own being. It's only once she's detached from that said being that she's allowed to realize that those actions, her work, her patrons, were all harmful to her. that this wasn't something deemed normal. Being a human, so to speak, allows her to see her reality as what it was, a perpetration against her rights. That new perspective on life isn't magically fixing all of Malice's problems either. In fact, it's only really forcing her to confront them and come to terms with the fact that with life comes its share of pain, and to know deeply that she doesn't deserve to be treated this way. What were deemed as unmoving, uncaring creatures of plastic shells and corrugated backgrounds are now given their full range of emotions. This is something she will have to live with forever, to know that the abuse she received was unjustified and unprompted, and that her friends too suffered from those same actions. In a way, it's not hard to see why Malice would choose her path in transforming everyone to be just like her. While initially it does seem like kind of a selfish desire, now that she feels something, she wants everyone to feel that way. It's also something deeply selfless. They have suffered just like I have, and I don't want them to suffer anymore. Where there's this initial thought of malice behind her actions, her moral shift is really well exemplified with a showcase of love for her friends. When Heather suffers a fatal wound and finds herself basically bleeding out, dying in a mix of pain and confusion, it's framed in this great way narratively speaking. As a doll, beyond the concept of no longer being animate, she couldn't really suffer from what we traditionally call death. Yes, her body would break down eventually, and that would be some form of spiritual death, but her body itself would still be fine. Now that she's flesh, that she's human, Heather is presented with the end of her life as something abhorrent and unjust. Why would this happen? Malice's actions would condemn her loved one to similar fates, unable to acknowledge that Heather's love for her care, weren't fake because she herself was synthetic, that it wasn't lesser because it didn't pump out directly from a human heart. It's only upon seeing that Malice is retroactively capable of understanding the world and her relationship to it. She returns to the repairer's room to confront the egg and ends up making a new wish, to set the world back to how it was. The egg doesn't budge nor speaks. It is completely unblinking in its judgment, giving the impression that what was done is done. But that's not really satisfactory, is it? You can't take that for an answer. Through lashing out, Malice breaks the red egg piece after piece until finally it opens. Inside she finds, deeply embedded, herself, or maybe even her doppelganger. It's never outright confirmed whether she's the real one or not, nor do I think it really matters in the grand scheme of things. All you need to know from that scene is that visceral feeling in your chest, knowing deep down that something's profoundly wrong about what you're seeing here. The Malice living in the egg states that she dreamed, but dolls don't dream. She dreamed of a world where dolls had bodies like hers. These contradicting copies of each other, reflections of one another, can't coexist in a world like this. Malice makes the ultimate sacrifice to return the world to what it was before, albeit now a world without her presence gracing it. Kind of a Konaka trademark at this point, with a few of his works focusing almost solely on one character who absolved themselves entirely from the plot, leaving others to feel only the pain of their absence. Lane choosing to reset the world in order to preserve her friend Alice's well-being, or even Chisa at the very start of the show who willingly chose to leave Lane's world behind in a similar fashion. Similarly, another Chisa, this one from Alice 6, who spends practically 90% of the show's runtime acting as the metaphorical White Rabbit, her absence guiding the other Alices through each plot beat, Alices of which finding themselves struggling to cope with the abstraction of a strange new world, familiar but all too different. By the end, Malice fuses with the red orb and is given once more a new form. Both her and Joe's new bodies kinda mirror each other in stylistic elements, practically inverses of each other. Malice, the now angelic siren, singing away the world's pains, while Joe has a more devilish body, willing to mend and defend. Said like that, he actually does give off big Devilman vibes. I guess Malice would be his Serene in that case, right? Tragic lovers who can never be together, no matter the incarnation. The world is fully reset, and the wish-granting moon ceases to be, taking the Malice we knew with it. All of her friends are back to normal. Plastic sheen intact, but in that, a certain sense of humanity that was maybe glossed over earlier can be felt resonating nonetheless. Joe continues his endless battle against leukocyte. The workers are all maintaining the world to the best of their abilities. It begs the question as to whether what we saw was just a dream or not, if any of this had any impact on the world or how it works. I mean, the whole thing is still decrepit, and eventually each machine and doll will stop functioning as the years go by. But for a second, you can almost feel like there's a faint glimmer of hope passing by. Heather recognizes Malice's voice in the horizon and runs to see her off. Angelic feathers of days past, she leaves the world behind her, forever in search of a new dream. I think a lot about the speech Joe has when first seeing Malice's human form. He doesn't recognize her and says something along the lines of, "Someone neither god nor doll will only serve to confuse this world," to which Malice replies incredibly earnestly, "What am I then? I am me." All of this circling back to something Konaka himself said in an interview, what is a doll? It's a question I ask myself a lot lately. I think more than your average person likely does. They are material objects, concepts, ideas and notions of emotions oftentimes left alone, abandoned to their own devices. Bystanders who unequivocally stand the test of time, even without direct human interaction, of a puppeteer controlling them. They are decidedly objects, unliving, yet have with them a certain spiritual quality. When talking about this, it's impossible not to think back on ideas of animism and its ties to religion, of object worship. It's a very human feeling to want to put a face, an image to something vague, something you feel but can't quite describe. Ancient texts oftentimes talk about shadow puppets, marionettes, and dolls as these occultic taboo items, puppet theaters of times past seen with the highest of praise for its innocent feeling of magical reverie, all while still remaining shrouded by the mystical. The role of the doll in occultic practices is a bit like the mask. It transports you into the realms unseen and allows things without a voice to speak for themselves. Gods, demons, the spirits of the dead. It's both energized by the practice, a human being operating it, but also still seen as a separate entity from its wielder. It's a strange tool used to convey things we can't quite come to terms with. Dolls are, in that way, something that feels inherently set apart from normal objects. Something that warrants heavy consideration and respect, so to speak. I think back specifically on the story of one German puppeteer who talked about the idea that puppets have multiple birthdays, that it, as an object, was basically born over and over again every time it was picked up by someone, with each pair of hands gracing it, that it basically harvested parts of the soul of its many puppeteers to the point where even the old dusty ones still felt animated by a certain residue of life, never quite able to die. Similarly, these are all things tied spiritually to views of childhood, of how someone might see their own possessions at that age, drenched by a child's endless flow of tears, oftentimes thrown away in a fit of rage, or even left to gather dust once you've grown tired of them. Dolls or objects change via the vector of your emotions, not unlike plush toys, oftentimes drooping and misshapen from years of tenderness, but in a way that infuses them with meaning. Malice, on the other hand, feels more like the opposite scenario, a collector's item spurned by its owner, something slowly rotting away, alone in an empty world. I'd argue that Malice, just like any other doll, has a sort of pseudo-matter-like quality to themselves. They're not the ones expressing those emotions, yet they seem to collect them from you interacting with them. That exact feeling is what makes them not quite doll, not quite human. The pure in-between of the imagined form. In the philosophy of toys, Charles Baudelaire imagines a child intellectually hungry for its toy in a way that ties directly into questions of humanity. That act is most likely everyone's first time questioning themselves to that degree, young enough to not truly understand that quandary, but still profoundly curious. Interrogating matters like what does a soul consist of? Where is it? How do you define the living and the inanimate? And where does that barrier stand when some objects are designed to mirror our very own appearances? It's all stuff that isn't necessarily out of the realm of questions asked by particularly curious children. I know I may make it sound overly complicated sometimes, or even silly for some, but it's where I personally found the desire to learn in the first place. I've never been one to break my toys apart, I wasn't that privileged, but my mind, even at that age, was obsessed with searching for answers. Especially now that I'm older, I can totally picture a younger version of myself who would have torn their toys apart gleefully in search of a soul, of humanity. The doll, no matter how tortured, has no answer, and with that endless silence comes a great desire for more knowledge. Nowadays though, I don't think the answer really matters all that much. I'm more in it for the journey rather than the destination, I guess. All this to say, toys are pretty much tied to the spirituality of childhood and its artistic conceptions. It's any child's first initiation to the world of art itself, or more likely, the first concrete example of it. It's something incredibly unique in how our relation to it is shaped from very early stages of consciousness, all the way through adulthood. In Rainer Maria Rilke's writings, he talks about how dolls are something we feed as children with ka, as in the ancient Egyptian term for life force, its opposite being the ba, meaning the personality, and that dolls will, in turn, absorb that love and care and return it to us in their own way. They allow themselves to be dreamed, imagined in their role as people capable of care, despite the very notion that at any moment they could cease to exist if you get distracted by another toy. He describes the idea that a doll, if it were to possess a soul, then would possess something not entirely human, something unique to itself, a doll soul or thing soul. For Rilke, those pristine objects of the material world also represent transitional guides to another one of adulthood, where things turn away from us, become more vague and less black or white. They speak to us very early on of concepts like death or absence. They are both common and strange all at once, and in that, they create a certain headspace prone to analyzing our relations with the world around us, our relations with them, and most importantly, our relations to our own bodies. To ask ourselves these questions about the life found within the unliving is to explore the fate of our own thoughts and instincts. Sigmund Freud's argument in The Uncanny, yes, we're going back there, trust me, is to suggest that the very notion of the animated doll operates on a visceral level to our human senses. The severed but still moving limb, the moving eye devoid of a body. These are all ideas that plague our mind by how it returns the notions of childhood, of the unknown, of the fear of the unknown. A time where an understanding of those was more vague and diluted by a lack of knowledge on how life works itself. These are habits most folks typically think as forgotten, as something of the past, but is still present, nestled deep within our minds. Those archaic fears, combined with a child's hunger for imagination, and their faith in the omnipotence of thought, feeds notions of the animated inanimate, the uncanniness being once more tied to the familiar. It's all stuff your brain naturally recognizes, but struggles to properly compartmentalize, almost as if those very follies ran against human nature, all while still permeating it in a permanent way. The unsettling thoughts in esoteric poetries regarding the doll's portent for animation is something that fundamentally operates within childlike confines. It always tries to stay accurate to the doll's characteristics of innocence. It is a toy. It is an object belonging to the world of childhood. Even as they show us dark reflections of the humanity trapped within ourselves, dolls, puppets, mannequins, statues, and automatons all the same become entities that reorient our concept of innocence as a whole, and therefore our ideas of childhood. The innocence presented within a doll isn't unlike the virgin ingénue destroyed by the hands of many. It is paradoxical in nature, constantly at odds with ever-shifting opposites, so in that, it becomes uncanny. In making Malice Doll, Chiaki J. Konaka, just like Simon Yotsuya and Anse Belmer did prior to him, continues on to elaborate on the ideas of dolls as objects of fetishism, not simply possessions of desire, but ones intrinsically tied to the very nature of obsession. But by giving dolls the ability to see and return those obsessive gazes thrust upon them, they end up transcending their origin as material commodities and become a two-way mirror into the very essence of the self. Those eyes become vector of agency, of autonomy, and most importantly, of identity. It's that simple fact that allows them to stand up and simply be beyond questions of other people's wants or needs. It places them in a strangely precarious position where a lot of people will see a certain distance created between the inanimate and their human creators, while I personally choose to see them as analogs of one another, different sides of the same coin. The anxiety one gets from seeing something a little too close to home, if you get what I mean. The bodies of dolls and their movements don't naturally lend themselves to what we traditionally consider human. It's almost a mockery of the human form, but in that, I find it to be a lot more special. Dolls are jointed creatures of animated automation. They're weird, strange, uncanny, beautiful, erotic, grotesque, timid, and uncaring all at once. To the untrained eye, they are nonsensical creatures of constant contradictions. They incarnate any role given to them without question or demand. They don't let themselves be defined by reality, instead trying their best to confront reality itself, to reject it wholly. Statues, mannequins, puppets, and dolls actualize some fantasies we have about our own selves, about our body's limitations and darkest thoughts. For example, the idea that life can exist, even persist within inanimate objects or bodies, that humans are strange creatures themselves, that we hide ourselves within our own shells. If dolls represent the anxieties attached to the idea that our bodies can too become inert one day, then they also embody the passion put behind outliving that seeming mortality. They supply to us in imagination something that maybe was lost over time. Because after all, dolls can be anything you want them to be. A semblance, an idol, a surrogate, an object of devotion, a material item, a substitute, a good luck charm, a dire omen. knowing and seeing, a vague form, a little girl, a stand-in, the virgin ingenue, virginity itself, a precious object, a pagan fetish, a toy, a sacred talisman, a partner, a commodity, a decoration, a collectible, a representation, the embodiment of the dead, of spirits and the living all intermixed at the same time. The doll, lifeless as it is, living as it is like you, is like me. Because really, I think there's something deeply human to honor within the doll in its form, to cherish the clumsy movements of something that is typically associated with a childlike toy, puppets on a string handled without care, with only primal intention in their heart, conveying the rawest of emotions. All in all, it is the doll's soul, so to speak, its alien uncanny motion, even at times mechanical elegance that comes with a deeply set image of our very own. Humans are, at their center, deeply graceless creatures. But truly, how often are you really in control of your body, all things considered? We all wish for eternal grace, but end up being self-conscious in front of others, anxious at the oncoming traffic, passing just a little too close to the sidewalk, walking in hopes not to be noticed by others. It's all kind of a natural performance whose grievances are aired every day, right? If that's the case, is the doll being manipulated more of an honest representation of humanity than the human stuck in the public eye pretending to be? The inanimate being the perfect simulacra, the human-like equivalent, calls into question the integrity of the self, of the body and mind that makes us what we are, of what lies hidden in the hollow recesses of their soft plastic shells, and forces us to dig within our own flesh. They are vessels for play, often forgotten by people, but never by time itself. And when you start identifying with them, you understand that you were one too right from the start. You get played with for a while, and when they get bored of you, they toss you aside. You just sit there, eyes open, because as a doll, it's the only thing you can do. To be that doll is to suffer the inherent cruelty of being born, of having been molded by unsteady and uncaring hands, just like a quickly assembled piece of furniture held only by painfully misaligned nails, a silent martyr to human intentions but still keeping us together in that moment, a curse to forever exist. Maybe that sort of mindset reflects more upon the creator than the doll itself. Where does the curious empathy for humanity's inhuman suffering start, and where does it end? If to be animate, like art historian Linda Need describes, is not simply to be living, but to possess the desire for life, as well as its very essence or spirit, then why do dolls, granted the clemency of borrowing a voice, scream eternally, "I never wanted to be human"?